The year was 1967, and winter had descended upon the Kentucky hills, not as a season, but as a heavy, suffocating shroud of iron and frost. In the deep, forgotten hollows of the Appalachians, where the sun struggles to touch the valley floor even in the height of June, the cold is a predatory thing. It doesn't merely nip at your skin, it settles deep within your marrow, a persistent, throbbing ache that serves as a constant reminder of your own fragile mortality. This was the world of the McCains, a family bound to the earth by generations of toil, and on this particular November evening, the earth had finally come to collect its due. High on the ridge, overlooking the churning, mud-thick waters of Crooked Creek, stood the McCain farmhouse. It was a skeletal structure of graying timber and hand-hewn stone, leaning precariously to the west, as if exhausted by the sheer weight of its own dark history. The porch boards, warped by decades of humidity and neglect, groaned under the pressure of the wind, sounding like the rhythmic, agonizing breaths of a dying giant. There was no light in the windows, save for the pale, sickly reflection of the moon against the grime-streaked glass, giving the house the appearance of a skull staring blindly into the void. Inside, the atmosphere was thick enough to taste. It was a stagnant cocktail of smells, the sharp, metallic tang of coal dust that seemed to coat every surface, the sour odor of unwashed linen, and the cloying, unmistakable scent of stagnant air that precedes a long overdue ending. The silence within the walls was not a peaceful one. It was a tactile, heavy presence, broken only by the scratching of field mice behind the lath and the occasional violent shudder of the chimney flue as the mountain gales battered the roof. In the master bedroom, lying upon a bed of cold iron and moth-eaten quilts, was Jacob McCain. He was the patriarch, a man whose hands were once as hard and unyielding as the limestone he had mined for 40 years, now reduced to a waxen effigy of his former self. His skin, once bronzed by the sun and blackened by the soot of the mines, was now the color of old parchment, stretched tight over a frame that had been hollowed out by obsession. Jacob was dead, but his passing had left a vacuum of terror in its wake. His eyes remained wide, glassy and fixed upon the peeling, water-stained wallpaper with a gaze of absolute, frozen horror. It was as if in his final, desperate moment of consciousness, he had seen something, some ancient, malevolent force, climbing out of the shadows of the room to greet him. His mouth was slightly agape, a dark, hollow void that seemed ready to spill one last, terrible secret that he had clutched to his chest until the very end. His fingers, gnarled like the roots of an old oak, were curled into claws, digging into the rough fabric of the mattress, as if he had tried to hold onto life by sheer brute force. Outside the window, the landscape was a study in desolation. The skeletal remains of a cornfield, harvested long ago, stood like rows of spears in the frozen mud. The creek below was a dark, pulsing vein, its waters swollen by early rains, carrying the debris as a high country down into the darkness of the lower valleys. The light that filtered through the clouds was a jaundiced, bruised purple, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the stagnant air of the bedroom, tiny, silent witnesses to a tragedy that was only just beginning to unfurl. But it was the object on the floor that held the true weight of the scene. Lying on a threadbare rug, just inches away from Jacob's dangling, lifeless hand, was a small, hand-carved figurine. It was fashioned from dark, polished walnut, representing a coiled serpent with its head reared back, fangs bared in a silent strike. To a stranger, it might have looked like a crude toy, a remnant of a simpler time. But to those who knew the McCain bloodline, it was the herald of a nightmare. The serpent's eyes,
painted with a strange, shimmering pigment, seemed to catch the dying light, reflecting a sinister intelligence that the dead man could no longer escape. Downstairs, in the kitchen, a rusted cast-iron stove sat cold and empty, its belly filled with gray ash. A single kerosene lamp sat on the wooden table, its wick dry, surrounded by stacks of yellowed tax receipts and hand-drawn maps that Jacob had obsessed over in his final months. These maps, covered in frantic, shaky lines and cryptic symbols of snakes and mountains, were the blueprints of his madness. He had convinced himself that the very ground beneath his feet was a vault, a hidden treasury of gold that would wash away the sins of his ancestors. Instead, it had become his tomb. The wind shrieked through the chimney once more, a sound like a woman's wail echoing through the empty hallways and up the creaking stairs. It was a lonely, bitter sound that seemed to mock the stillness of the house. Outside, a rusted 1948 Ford truck sat mired in the freezing mud of the driveway, its engine cold and its metal skin pitted with the orange rot of rust. The world outside the McCain farm was indifferent to the passing of its master, yet the very earth seemed to vibrate with a restless, malevolent energy, as if the ground itself were exhaling a long-held breath. Jacob McCain was gone, but the silence he left behind was louder than any scream. The secret of Crooked Creek remained clutched in the cold, unmoving heart of the dead man, a poison that was already beginning to seep into the veins of his sons. The curse had been awakened, and it would not sleep until the McCain name was nothing more than a whispered warning in the wind, a bitter memory buried under the cold, unyielding Kentucky clay.
The morning that followed Jacob McCain's passing brought no reprieve from the biting Appalachian cold. Instead, the dawn arrived as a thin, watery light that struggled to pierce the dense, suffocating fog, a mist the locals called ghost breath, which clung to the jagged ridges and filled the hollows like a rising tide of milk. In this part of Kentucky, the mountains don't just surround you, they weigh upon you, their ancient, limestone hearts indifferent to the fleeting lives of the men who scratch at their surface. The air was a sharp, crystalline weight that burned the lungs, carrying the heavy, pervasive scent of wet slate, rotting pine needles, and the distant, acrid tang of coal fires that never truly went out. At the edge of the McCain property, where the gravel road dissolved into a treacherous track of frozen mud and jagged rock, the silence of the woods was absolute. It was a silence born of isolation, a stillness so profound that the snap of a dry twig sounded like a pistol shot echoing through the valley. The trees, mostly skeletal oaks and garnered hickories, stood like silent sentinels, their leafless branches coated in a fine glaze of rime ice that glittered with a cold, deceptive beauty. Every few minutes, a gust of wind would tear through the gorge, causing the ice-laden boughs to clatter together with a sound like dry bones knocking in the dark. Standing near the rusted gates of the farm was an old Ford pickup, a relic of a more prosperous era, now reduced to a hunk of oxidizing iron. Its hood was feathered with frost, and its engine, cold and stubborn, refused to catch, emitting only a mechanical, rhythmic cough that died out into the mist. This truck was a metaphor for the region itself, hard-working, broken, and slowly being reclaimed by the red clay of the earth. The smell of unburnt gasoline lingered in the damp air, mixing with the earthy musk of the disturbed ground where the brothers had paced, waiting for the coroner who lived 3 towns over and took his time for mountain folk. The McCain brothers, John, Thomas, and Samuel, stood on the sagging porch of the farmhouse, their figures shrouded in the gloom. They were men built of corded muscle and suppressed resentment, their faces weathered by the relentless cycle of the seasons and the backbreaking labor of the mines. They wore heavy, oil-stained Kansas coats and wool caps pulled low over their brows, their hands tucked deep into their pockets to hide the tremors brought on by the cold, or perhaps by the realization that they were now the masters of a dying estate. They didn't speak. In the Appalachians, silence is often a form of armor, a way to keep your thoughts from being stolen by the wind. Every few seconds, the rhythmic, distant thud of a pickaxe could be heard from a neighboring ridge where some other poor soul was trying to coast a living out of a dying seam of coal. It was the heartbeat of the valley, a reminder that life here was a constant war against the landscape.
The breath of the mountains was exhaled through the vents of abandoned mine shafts, carrying the smell of sulfur and old, stale earth from deep within the crust. It was a scent that had followed the McCains their entire lives, a reminder that they were sons of the dark, more comfortable in the shadows of the earth than in the light of the sun. As the fog began to shift, revealing the churning brown waters of Crooked Creek below, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The creek was a violent, pulsing vein of runoff, carrying the debris of the high country, uprooted saplings, jagged stones, and the occasional carcass of a drowned deer, down into the depths of the forest. The water hissed as it broke against the boulders, a sound that Thomas McCain always thought resembled the whispering of 1,000 voices, all of them demanding a price for the land's secrets. The dampness from the creek rose up the hillside, settling into the timber of the house and making the walls feel soft and rotted to the touch. Inside the kitchen, the only warmth came from a small, sputtering ire in the hearth, fueled by green wood that hissed and popped, releasing plumes of bitter, stinging smoke. A single pot of coffee sat on the grate, its smell, burnt and metallic, providing the only comfort in a room that felt increasingly like a tomb. The floorboards beneath the brothers' boots were worn smooth by generations of McCains, yet they felt treacherous now, as if the house itself were reconsidering its loyalty to the living. The shadows in the corners of the room didn't retreat from the firelight. They seemed to lean in, listening to the unspoken greed that was already beginning to boil in the hearts of the survivors. This was the breath of the mountains, not a life-giving breeze, but a cold, indifferent sigh that reminded the McCains of their insignificance. The landscape was a mosaic of gray stone and brown mud, a place where the only thing that grew without effort was misery. As the brothers finally turned to look at the closed door of their father's bedroom, the weight of the ridge seemed to press down on the roof, a physical force that demanded submission. They were no longer just men, they were extensions of the terrain, shaped by the same harsh forces that had carved the gorge and twisted the trees. And like the mountains, they were beginning to hide secrets that would never see the light of day. The mist didn't lift that day. It simply thickened, swallowing the farmhouse and the creek, until the world was reduced to a few feet of visibility. It was a sensory deprivation that forced a man to look inward, and what the McCain brothers saw in their own minds was far more terrifying than the ghosts in the fog. The Appalachian wilderness was reclaiming its own, starting with the spirit of the patriarch and moving steadily towards the sons. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the frozen brush, was a reminder that in this hollow, you are never truly alone. The land is always watching, always breathing, and always waiting for its next payment in blood.
The week following the funeral was not a time of mourning, but a period of profound, suffocating observation. The McCain farmhouse had become a labyrinth of unspoken questions, where every shadow felt like a lingering fragment of Jacob's fractured mind. The three brothers moved through the rooms like ghosts, their footfalls heavy and deliberate on the wide-planked floors of white oak. But it was the floorboards themselves that seemed to hold the true weight of the house's history. They were seasoned by decades of spilled lie, tracked-in coal dust, and the rhythmic pacing of a man who had slowly traded his sanity for a ghost story. Jacob's madness had not been a sudden break, but a slow, rhythmic erosion, much like the way Crooked Creek wore down the limestone banks. In his final months, the patriarch had ceased to be a man of action and had become a creature of the floorboards. He would spend hours in the dead of night, his heavy boots dragging across the wood, pacing a frantic, repetitive path from the cold hearth to the corner of the master bedroom. The sound had become the metronome of the house, a dry, rasping scrape that kept his sons awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering what their father was chasing in the dark. He had been looking for a way in, or perhaps a way out, convinced that the very foundation of their home was merely a lid on a vault of untold riches. The air in the house remained thick with the scent of Jacob's obsession, a mix of old, damp parchment, the copper tang of the keys he was constantly fumbling with, and the sharp, medicinal odor of the cheap tonic he drank to quiet the voices. He had spoken incessantly of the serpent's hoard, a cache of revolutionary gold, or perhaps older, tribal wealth, supposedly buried by fleeing scouts during the brutal Indian wars that had once soaked this soil in blood. To Jacob, the gold wasn't just metal, it was a divine right, a compensation for a lifetime of breathing dust and breaking his back for companies that didn't know his name. He had turned the floor into a map, scratching cryptic symbols into the wood with a pocket knife, serpents, jagged mountain peaks, and X marks that aligned with nothing in the physical world. Now that he was gone, the silence he left behind was filled with a new, sharper tension.
John, Thomas, and Samuel found themselves looking down more than they looked at each other. They became obsessed with the unevenness of the planks, the way certain boards creaked with a hollow, echoing resonance that suggested a void beneath. The kitchen, usually the heart of the home, felt cold and hollowed out. The brothers would sit around the scarred wooden table, drinking coffee that tasted like iron, their eyes tracing the grain of the floor as if the wood might suddenly become transparent and reveal the yellow glint of coins. John, the eldest, was the most calculated in his scrutiny. He remembered how Jacob would kneel in the corner of the pantry, his ear pressed to the wood, whispering to the earth as if it were a lover. John began to notice subtle signs that the floor had been tampered with, screw heads that were slightly stripped, or gaps between the planks that had been meticulously cleaned of dust. The house felt like it was guarding a secret, its walls leaning in to overhear the brothers' thoughts. The smell of rot wood and rising damp from the crawlspace below acted as a constant reminder that something was festering beneath them, something that went beyond mere greed. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, when the mountain mist pressed against the windows like a physical weight, the house felt alive with the echoes of Jacob's frantic sketches. He'd have filled hundreds of scraps of paper, old tax receipts, the margins of a family Bible, the backs of funeral fans, with lines that bled into one another. These maps were not of the land, but of a fever dream. He claimed the gold was protected by a blood tax, an ancient covenant that required a life for every ounce taken. He had warned them, in his final wheezing breaths, that the mountains did not give up their treasures to the unworthy. But the sons were young, and the hunger of poverty was a louder voice than the warnings of a dying madman. Samuel, the youngest and most impressionable, began to mimic his father's behavior. He would spend his evenings sitting on the floor, his fingers tracing the deep gouges Jacob had left in the oak. He claimed he could feel a warmth radiating from the boards, a pulse that beat in time with the creak outside. The psychological rot was spreading, moving from the patriarch to the progeny. The brothers began to distrust the very ground they stood on, fearing that one of them would find a loose board and keep the prize for himself. They stopped leaving the house at the same time, ensuring that at least one pair of eyes was always watching the floor. The conflict was no longer about survival in the harsh Kentucky wilds. It was a war of nerves over a square footage of decaying timber. The secret in the floorboards had become the true master of the McCain house. It wasn't just about the potential for gold, it was the way the mystery had stripped them of their brotherhood, replacing it with a cold, predatory alertness. The smell of the house changed. The comforting scent of home was replaced by the acrid smell of old wood being pried apart, and the stale, dusty air of hidden spaces. As the first snow of the season began to drift against the doors, the McCains were trapped inside with the ghost of their father's greed. They could almost hear the scraping of his boots again, a phantom sound that seemed to come from beneath the very planks they stood upon. The floorboards held the history of their bloodline, every scratch and stain a testament to their struggle. But now those boards were a barrier, a wooden veil between a life of misery and a dream of gold that was rapidly turning into a nightmare of obsession. The secret was there, hidden in the dark, damp silence of the joists, waiting for the first brother to pick up a crowbar and tear the family apart.
The year 1968 arrived in the Hollows not with the heralded summer of love seen on the flickering television screens in the city, but with a relentless, bone-chilling dampness that turned the world into a landscape of gray mud. The spring thaw was unusually violent that year. The snow on the high ridges didn't just melt, it collapsed, gorging the mountain veins until Crooked Creek became a churning, vengeful artery of brown water and debris. The air was thick with the scent of wet stone, crushed pine, and the primal, metallic odor of a river that had breached its banks. For John McCain, the eldest son, the roar of the water had become a siren song, a deafening white noise that drowned out the voices of caution. John had always been the pragmatist, the one who looked at a mountain and saw tonnage rather than majesty. But the secret Jacob left behind had a way of eroding even the hardest logic. In the dark hours of the early morning, while the house was still and the only sound was the rhythmic drip of condensation from the eaves, John had meticulously studied the final, most frantic sketches his father had produced. These weren't maps of the house's floorboards, but of the creek's bend, a specific, jagged elbow of land where the water slowed just enough for a man to sink a shovel. John became convinced that his father hadn't been looking under the house, but from the house toward the water. The morning of his disappearance, the atmosphere was heavy with a low-hanging fog that tasted of sulfur and iron. John left the farmhouse before the sun had even cleared the ridge, carrying a rusted spade and a canvas satchel. The woods were silent, save for the distant, thunderous growl of the creek. Every step he took into the mud felt like the land was trying to hold him back,
the red clay clinging to his boots like desperate fingers. The smell of the forest was suffocating, the rot of last year's leaves and the sharp, cold ozone of the rising water. John didn't look back at the house. His eyes were fixed on the churning silt of the creek, his mind a fever dream of yellow glints beneath the murk. By noon, the rain began to fall, not a gentle spring shower, but a cold, stinging deluge that turned the steep banks into slick, treacherous slides. The creek had become a monster. Huge trunks of ancient oaks, uprooted by the current, tumbled through the water like toothpicks, grinding against the boulders with a sound that resembled the moaning of giants. John was found late that evening, not by a search party, but by the silence he left behind. Thomas and Samuel followed his tracks to the water's edge, where the bank had given way in a massive, jagged collapse. When they finally pulled John's body from the freezing silt, he was a study in Appalachian tragedy. His lungs were filled with the very mud he had hoped would yield a fortune, and his skin had taken on the blue-gray hue of the limestone cliffs. But it was the sight of his right hand that froze the blood of his brothers. Even in the rigor of death, John's fingers were locked in a crushing, desperate grip around a piece of ancient carved bone. It was yellowed with age and stained by the river's tannins, meticulously shaped into the head of a serpent with its jaws wide, identical in every detail to the wooden carving found in Jacob's death room. The air around the brothers felt as though it had been sucked out of the valley. The smell of the river, the cold, fishy stench of deep water silt and decaying organic matter, clung to John's clothes like a shroud. The discovery was a silent, terrifying confirmation. The serpent's hoard was not merely a delusion of a dying man. It was real, and it was demanding its first installment. The bone in John's hand wasn't gold, but it was a key, a physical piece of a puzzle that had now cost a McCain his life. The blood tax Jacob had whispered about was no longer a metaphor. It was a cold, wet reality lying on the bank of Crooked Creek. As they carried John's heavy, sodden corpse back up the ridge toward the farmhouse, the mountains seemed to lean in, the shadows of the trees lengthening like reaching arms. The sound of the creek followed them, a low, guttural roar that now sounded like laughter. The house, when they reached it, looked smaller, more fragile against the backdrop of the darkened peaks. Inside, the silence was no longer heavy, it was jagged. Eliza, their mother, stood in the doorway, her eyes wide as she saw the burden they carried. She didn't scream. She simply turned and walked to the kitchen to boil water, her movements mechanical and hollow. The first sacrifice had been made, and the price of the secret had been set. John's death didn't act as a warning to Thomas and Samuel. Instead, it acted as a catalyst. The sight of the carved bone had validated their father's madness, turning a tragedy into a terrifying justification. The smell of the house changed that night. The scent of wet wool and death replaced the smell of coal dust. As they laid John out on the parlor table, the carved bone sat on the mantel, its shimmering, painted eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. The serpent had tasted McCain blood, and the remaining brothers knew, deep in their marrow, that the mountains were just getting started.
The burial of John McCain was a hurried, somber affair, conducted under a sky the color of a bruised plum. But as the first shovelfuls of heavy, red Kentucky clay thudded onto his pine casket, the grief that should have united the remaining brothers was already being replaced by a virulent, festering suspicion. By the winter of 1969, the farmhouse had transformed from a home into a theater of Cold War. The atmosphere was no longer merely thick, it was poisonous, saturated with the acrid scent of stale coffee, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic tang of kerosene lamps burning deep into the night. Trust had died with John, washed away in the silt of the creek, and in its place grew a rot that consumed the very foundations of their brotherhood. Thomas and Samuel McCain began to move through the house like two predators sharing a shrinking territory. They avoided eye contact, their gazes instead fixed on the floor, the walls, or the pockets of each other's coats. The silence between them was not the comfortable quiet of kin, but a jagged, electrified stillness. Every sound in the house was scrutinized, the scrape of a chair, the clearing of a throat, or the rhythmic creak of a floorboard underfoot. They began to interpret every movement as a potential betrayal. If Thomas spent too long in the barn, Samuel would watch from the kitchen window, his eyes narrowed,
convinced his brother was hiding a new discovery. If Samuel lingered by the creek, Thomas would follow him at a distance, a shotgun cradled in the crook of his arm, his thumb tracing the safety. The house itself seemed to reflect this internal decay. The walls, once familiar and protective, now felt like they were closing in, the peeling paper wallpaper resembling the sloughing skin of a snake. The smell of the parlor, where John had been laid out, never truly left. It was a lingering odor of lilies and damp earth that clung to the curtains. They began to divide the property with an obsessive, clinical precision. Rusted barbed wire, scavenged from the old pastures, was strung across the yard, marking his side and mine. These wires were like jagged stitches across a wound that refused to heal. Even the communal meals became a ritual of silent hostility. They sat at opposite ends of the scarred oak table, the only sound being the aggressive clink of silverware against chipped porcelain. Paranoia began to manifest in physical ways. Thomas grew a thick, unkempt beard that hid his twitching jaw, his eyes darting toward the corners of the room as if he expected the shadows to speak. He started sleeping in the parlor, his back against the wall, a heavy iron poker always within reach. Samuel, meanwhile, became obsessively neat, as if by controlling the placement of every tin can and tool, he could control the chaos of his own mind. He began to mark the dust on the shelves, creating invisible traps to see if Thomas had been prying into his father's old footlocker. The brotherhood had become a zero-sum game. For one to find the gold, the other had to be kept in the dark. The psychological weight of the serpent's hoard was now a physical presence in the room, a third brother made of greed and shadow. They began to hear things, or thought they did. The scratching of rats in the walls was interpreted as the sound of a shovel hitting stone. The whistling of the wind through the chimney was heard as a whispered secret meant for the other's ears. They were no longer mourning John, they were envying him, for he at least seen a piece of the truth before the water took him. The carved bone serpent sat on the mantelpiece, a silent, malevolent judge. Its polished surface seemed to glow in the dim light, its unblinking eyes watching the brothers devour each other from the inside out. Their mother, Eliza, became a ghost in her own kitchen, moving with a silent, terrifying grace. She watched her remaining sons with a look of profound, hollowed-out sorrow, but she no longer interfered. She could smell the rot. It was the same smell that had preceded Jacob's madness. It was the scent of a family turning on itself, a scent more pungent than any coal fire or mountain mist. The house felt cold, even when the hearth was roaring, as if the very air were being sucked out by the vacuum of their mutual hatred. The blood tax Jacob had warned them about was being paid in installments of sanity and love, and the ledger was far from balanced. By the time the first snow of the season began to dust the ridges, the isolation was total. The McCains had cut themselves off from the neighbors, from the town, and finally from each other. They were two men trapped in a wooden box, waiting for the other to blink, waiting for a sign, waiting for the mountain to speak again. The distrust was a living thing now, a serpent coiled in the center of the home, its scales cold, and its venom slow-acting. The once sturdy McCain line was fraying, the threads snapping one by one under the weight of a secret that refused to be shared.
By the dawn of 1970, the youngest brother, Samuel, had become a translucent ghost of the man he once was. The transition from grief to obsession had been seamless, a slow-acting poison that had finally reached his heart. He no longer looked like a man of 24. His skin had taken on the sallow, grayish hue of the river silt, and his eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, burning with a frantic, feverish light. He had abandoned his post at the coal mines months ago, walking away from the only steady paycheck the family had left, claiming that the clatter of the machinery drowned out the whispers of the creek. To Samuel, the world of the living, of work, food, and sleep, had become a distraction from the true work of the McCains. He spent his days and a growing number of his nights knee-deep in the freezing, churning waters of Crooked Creek. The winter of 1970 was particularly brutal, with jagged ice floes scraping against the banks like broken glass, yet Samuel seemed immune to the cold. He would stand for hours in the numbing current, his hands submerged in the mud, his fingers clawing at the sharp stones of the riverbed. His fingernails were permanently torn, the quicks bleeding into the water, and his knuckles were swollen and blue from the constant exposure. He was no longer digging, he was searching for a pulse. He spoke to the water in a low, rhythmic, guttural chant, a mixture of prayers and curses that made the hair on the back of Thomas's neck stand on end whenever he watched from the ridge. The atmosphere surrounding Samuel was one of profound, damp decay. He carried the smell of the creek with him everywhere,
a pungent, earthy odor of rotted vegetation, cold minerals, and stagnant water. When he did return to the house, he refused to sit at the table, instead crouching in the corner of the kitchen, his muddy overalls dripping onto the floorboards that Jacob had once paced. He would stare at the carved bone serpent on the mantelpiece, his lips moving in a silent dialogue with the artifact. He claimed that the serpent was thirsty and that the creek would only yield the gold once it had been fed enough effort. His madness was a heavy, palpable thing that filled the room like smoke, making it hard for anyone else to breathe. Samuel's physical deterioration was accompanied by a terrifying mental clarity, or so he believed. He began to see patterns in the way the water broke over the rocks, convinced that the ripples were a language, a map written in fluid that only he could decipher. He started bringing stones back from the creek, smooth river rocks that he arranged in intricate swirling patterns on his bedroom floor. He claimed they were seeds of the gold, and that if he tended to them correctly, they would bloom into the hoard his father had promised. The sound of him rearranging these stones in the dead of night, the dry, rhythmic click-clack of rock against rock, became the new heartbeat of the house, replacing the scraping of Jacob's boots. Thomas watched his brother's descent with a mixture of horror and predatory calculation. He saw Samuel's madness as a potential advantage. If Samuel found the spot, Thomas could simply step in and take what was theirs. But as the months dragged on, the horror began to outweigh the greed. Samuel had stopped eating almost entirely, his body cannibalizing its own muscle until his ribs stood out like the hull of a wrecked ship. He began to suffer from hallucinations, claiming that John was standing in the middle of the creek, holding a lantern made of gold, beckoning him deeper into the dark, swirling pools where the current was strongest. The smell of the house changed again during this period, taking on the scent of an open grave. The dampness Samuel brought in never dried. It seeped into the furniture, the rugs, and the wallpaper, creating blooms of black mold that looked like spreading bruises. The isolation of the hollow felt absolute now, as if the mountains had folded in on the McCain farm to hide the shame of Samuel's condition. Every time the wind shrieked down the chimney, Samuel would bolt upright, his eyes wide and dilated, screaming that they were coming to take his share. He had become a prisoner of his own mind, a man who had traded the sun for the cold, dark secrets of the mud. As autumn turned back into winter, Samuel's obsession reached a breaking point. He began to cut himself, small nicks on his forearms, letting the blood drip into a jar of creek water he kept by his bed. He called it priming the pump, a ritualistic sacrifice to ensure the mountains would finally open their mouth. The blood tax was no longer a distant threat, it was a daily transaction. Thomas found him one evening shivering violently in the parlor, clutching the carved bone serpent to his chest like a holy relic, whispering that the big water was coming to take him home. The descent was nearly complete. Samuel was no longer a McCain, but a creature of Crooked Creek, waiting for the final invitation to join his brother in the dark.
The winter of 1972 entered the annals of Appalachian history not merely as a season of cold, but as a period of white terror. This was not the gentle snow that blankets the earth in a quiet slumber. It was a crystalline siege. The sky over Kentucky had transformed into a heavy, leaden vault that seemed to descend lower with each passing day, crushing the ridges in its frozen grip. The wind that shrieked down from the high peaks didn't just blow, it howled with a predatory cadence, ripping through the gaps in the McCain farmhouse with sounds that mimicked the groans of 1,000 tormented souls. The air was so dry and frigid that every breath felt like a bayonet thrust into the lungs, and the sharp scent of ozone and frozen pine needles had displaced all other aromas, leaving only a sense of sterile, hostile vacancy. Inside the house, the silence was louder than any thunder. Thomas sat by the hearth, watching the flames devour the last log of seasoned oak. The wood's popping sounded like pistol shots, puncturing the electrified tension of the kitchen. Samuel, who had spent the last several weeks confined to his room in a state of catatonic obsession, suddenly appeared in the doorway. His appearance was ghastly. His eyes, glowing with a manic, bioluminescent brilliance in the shadows, were sunken so deep into his skull that they looked like twin voids. His skin was stretched tight over his facial bones, resembling old, desiccated chamois leather. He was not dressed for the sub-zero temperatures, wearing only a thin flannel shirt and mud-stained overalls, yet he seemed entirely immune to the biting chill. In his hand he clutched an old iron lantern, its wick barely flickering, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like skeletal limbs against the walls. "They have opened the doors, Thomas," Samuel whispered, his voice nothing more than the dry rasp of dead leaves skittering across a grave. "The water has turned to glass, but the gold is heating the earth from below. It calls. Father is waiting for me by the gorge. He has found the vein." Thomas reached out to stop him, his hand trembling, but a primal, icy force seemed to bolt him to his chair.
He could only watch in a trance of horror as his last remaining brother stepped out into the night, leaving the front door wide open. A vortex of crystalline frost immediately surged into the house, extinguishing the fire in the hearth and turning the warmth of the kitchen into a frozen tomb in a matter of seconds. The smell of raw snow, pure, cruel, and indifferent, filled the room. Thomas sat in a state of paralysis for hours, listening to the blizzard roar outside, turning the world into a white abyss where all landmarks and hopes were erased. When the sun finally rose, it brought no warmth, only a blinding, surgical light that made the eyes ache with a dull throb. Thomas, clutching his father's old double-barrel shotgun with numb fingers, stepped onto the porch. The world had been redesigned. The farm was buried under drifts of snow that reached the eaves of the barn, hiding the jagged scars of the earth. But upon this perfect white canvas, a single violent trail of footprints was carved. Samuel hadn't merely walked, he had run, his strides erratic and wide, driven by a frantic energy. The tracks led directly toward the most treacherous part of Crooked Creek, where the riverbed narrowed into a deep, malevolent chasm known by the locals as the Serpent's Maw. Thomas followed the trail, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The atmosphere of the forest was suffocating. The frozen trees stood motionless, like petrified witnesses at an execution. As he neared the precipice, the smell of iron and disturbed earth began to bleed through the scent of the frost. At the very edge of the gorge, the tracks stopped abruptly. There were no signs of a struggle, no frantic clawing in the snow, only a vast, yawning silence filled with the blue mists of the canyon and the jagged, ice-covered rocks far below. On the very brink of the abyss, Thomas found the remnants of his brother's madness. Lying in the snow was a glass jar filled with rusted bottle caps from the 1940s and jagged shards of pyrite, the fool's gold that had served as Samuel's currency in his final days. Beside it laid a lantern, its glass shattered by the thermal shock of the cold. But it was the sight on the frozen rock that made Thomas collapse to his knees. Scattered across the ice were what appeared to be gold coins, shimmering with an illusory brilliance in the morning light. When Thomas reached out to touch them, his fingers met only yellow ice, frozen droplets of some unknown, bitter fluid that had crystallized in the shape of wealth. Samuel was gone, as if he had been exhaled by the mountain itself. His body was not recovered that winter, nor the following spring when the ice finally groaned and broke, turning the creek into a thundering torrent of mud and timber. The mountains had claimed him, just as they had claimed Jacob and John, but this time they didn't even leave a corpse for the ritual of burial. Thomas returned to the house alone, feeling the entire weight of the ridge settled onto his shoulders. In Samuel's room, everything remained as it was, the patterns of river stones on the floor and the persistent smell of raw creek water that had now permanently bonded with the grain of the wood. That night, Thomas held it for the first time. Deep within the gorge, through the rhythmic whistling of the wind, came a sound. Clink, clink, clink. It was the unmistakable strike of a pickaxe against solid stone. The sound was distant, muffled by layers of ice and earth, yet it was persistent. It was as if Samuel, somewhere in the dark beneath the roots of the mountain, had finally found his vein and could no longer stop, carving his fortune out of the dead heart of the hills. Thomas boarded up the windows, but he knew the barrier was useless. The mountains do not enter from the outside, they grow within, turning blood to stone and dreams to frozen dust. The McCain line was now a dynasty of one living man, and a legion of ghosts waiting just beyond the candlelight.
By the spring of 1973, the McCain farmhouse had ceased to be a place of shelter and had become a monument to isolation. Eliza McCain, the matriarch who had once filled the kitchen with the scent of sourdough and wild ramps, had retreated into a psychological bunker. The loss of 3 men, her husband to madness, and 2 sons to the mountain, had snapped the final thread of her connection to the world outside the hollow. The air inside the house was no longer just stagnant, it was heavy with the smell of wood smoke, raw cedar, and the sharp acidic tang of the lye she used to scrub the floors until the wood was white and splintered. She moved through the rooms like a mechanical doll, her eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on a reality that only she could perceive. The atmosphere was one of claustrophobic dread. Eliza began to believe that the very air outside was a carrier for the mountain fever that had taken her family. She became obsessed with sealing the house, not against the cold, but against the spirits she believed were trying to claw their way back in. She took up a hammer and heavy oak planks, and one by one she began to nail the windows shut from the inside.
The rhythmic thud, thud, thud of her hammer became the new soundtrack of the McCain estate, a grim percussion that echoed across the valley. She didn't just cover the glass, she reinforced the frames until the house was a windowless box of shadows, illuminated only by the flickering, guttering flames of tallow candles that smelled of animal fat and scorched wick. The sensory details of Eliza's fortress were overwhelming. The light that managed to seep through the cracks in the boards was a dim, dusty amber, highlighting the cobwebs that she now refused to clear, claiming they were nets for the bad thoughts. The house felt smaller, the ceilings lower, as the darkness pressed in. Eliza spent her days in the kitchen, obsessively polishing the family's silver in the heady iron pots, her movements frantic and rhythmic. She spoke to the walls, her voice a low, melodic humming that occasionally broke into a whispered argument with the ghosts of Jacob and Samuel. She claimed they were standing just outside the boarded-up windows, their fingernails scratching against the wood, begging for a way back into the warmth. The smell of the house transformed into a pungent mix of scorched earth and old damp paper. Eliza had begun a ritual of cleansing by burning anything that belonged to the dead. She fed the hearth with Jacob's maps, John's old boots, and Samuel's patterns of river stones. The smoke was thick and bitter, stinging the eyes and coating the lungs in a fine layer of soot. To Thomas, who watched his mother spiral into this fortress of the mind, the house felt like it was being prepared for a funeral pyre. He would find her sitting in the dark, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the front door. She had piled heavy furniture against the entrance, a dresser, a sideboard, a trunk filled with stones, creating a barricade that required a man's full strength to move. Eliza's madness was a quiet, domestic horror. She didn't scream, she simply made the world smaller and smaller until it consisted only of the four walls of the kitchen and the sound of her own heartbeat. She began to hoard food, hiding jars of preserved peaches and salted pork beneath the floorboards, convinced that a great hunger was coming to the hollow. The clinking of the jars against the joists reminded Thomas of the sound Samuel had made with his stones, a hereditary rhythm of obsession that seemed to be the only legacy the McCains had left. The house was no longer a home, it was a sarcophagus of wood and iron, holding a woman who was already half transformed into a shadow. The conflict between Thomas and his mother was a silent war of attrition. He would try to pry a board off a window to let in a sliver of the spring sun, only for Eliza to nail it back twice as hard the moment he turned his back. She viewed him with a mixture of love and profound suspicion, believing that he too was becoming a creature of the creek. She wouldn't let him touch the silver, fearing his hands would tarnish it with the yellow dust of the hoard. The isolation was total. The neighbors no longer came to the gate, and the mailman left the letters in a box at the end of the road, too afraid of the woman who watched from the darkness behind the planks. As the summer heat intensified, the house became a kiln. The lack of ventilation made the air thick and humid, the smell of the unwashed bodies and the wood smoke becoming a suffocating blanket. Eliza seemed to thrive in the heat, her thin frame becoming even more skeletal, her hair a wild silver mane that glowed in the candlelight. She had successfully created a world where the mountain couldn't reach her, but in doing so, she had locked herself in with the very madness she sought to escape. The McCain fortress was a testament to the blood tax, a mother's sanity paid to the mountain in exchange for the safety of a tomb. Thomas realized, as he sat in the sweltering dark, that the house didn't need a curse. They were doing a fine job of destroying themselves, one nail at a time.
The year 1975 arrived in the Appalachians like a rusted blade, sharp and jagged. For Thomas McCain, the world beyond the hollow had become a blurry, hostile abstraction, while the land he stood upon felt more alive and more treacherous than ever. He was now the last man standing in a fortress of ghosts. But the outside world, driven by the cold logic of ledgers and law, finally came to collect. The Millers, a family of hard-eyed farmers from the neighboring ridge, had long coveted the lower woods of the McCain property, the very land where Crooked Creek snaked through the valley and where Thomas believed the serpent's hoard remained hidden beneath the silt. The conflict ignited over a matter of unpaid taxes and a disputed survey line, but beneath the legal jargon lay a primal feud. The Millers didn't care about the curse, they cared about the timber and the grazing rights. One humid afternoon in late August, when the air was so heavy with moisture it felt like breathing through wool, Thomas found a crew of Miller men stringing new wire across the creek bed. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of crushed ferns, diesel from their idling truck, and the metallic tang of fresh galvanized wire. To Thomas, this wasn't just a trespass, it was a desecration of his family's blood-soaked sanctuary. Thomas descended from the ridge like a shadow. He didn't come with a lawyer or a deed. He came with a double-bit axe and a 12-gauge shotgun cradled in his arms. His appearance was enough to give the younger Miller boys pause. He was gaunt, his skin the color of old pine bark, and his eyes carried the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had spent too many nights listening to the floorboards talk. He stood on the muddy bank, his boots sinking into the red clay,
the very ground where his brother John had breathed his last. "You're standing on dead men's ground," Thomas said, his voice a low, guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate with the hum of the cicadas in the trees. "This land has already been paid for. Move the wire, or I'll use it to stitch you to the earth." The elder miller, a man named Silas with a face like a cracked riverbed, didn't flinch. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the creek and stepped forward, his hand resting on the holster of a sidearm. The standoff was a grim tableau of Appalachian pride, two families, both shaped by the same harsh hills, now ready to kill over a few acres of mud. The smell of the woods changed in that instant, the sweet scent of summer rot replaced by the sharp, electric ozone of impending violence. The cicadas seemed to scream louder, a frantic, rhythmic pulsing that mirrored the blood thumping in Thomas's temples. The millers laughed, a dry, mocking sound that echoed off the limestone cliffs. They called the McCains the living dead, a family of lunatics who traded their lives for fool's gold. But when Thomas raised the axe and struck the new fence post with a single violent blow, the laughter died. The wood splintered with a crack that sounded like a bone snapping. In Thomas's mind, he wasn't just cutting a post, he was protecting the secret that had consumed his father and killed his brothers. He was the guardian of a lie that had become more real than the truth. The confrontation didn't end in a massacre that day, but it set the stage for a slow, agonizing war of attrition. The millers retreated for the moment, but they left behind a curse of their own, a promise to return with the sheriff and the law. As they drove away, the black exhaust from their truck hung in the valley like a funeral veil. Thomas stood alone by the water, the smell of the disturbed mud rising up to meet him. He felt the mountain watching him, the serpent's maw of the gorge seeming wider than before. The outside world had finally noticed the McCains, and they were coming for the only thing Thomas had left, the dirt. By the time he returned to the boarded-up house, the sun was setting, casting long, bloody streaks across the ridges. Eliza was waiting behind the door, her hammer in hand, ready to nail down any new cracks in their reality. Thomas realized that the fence was just the beginning. The blood tax was no longer a private family matter. The world was coming to collect its share, and Thomas McCain was prepared to burn every tree and dry every creek before he let a miller touch a single stone of his father's dream. The border war had begun, and in the Appalachians, such wars only ended when the land had enough blood to satisfy its thirst.
The year 1978 arrived with a sense of finality that weighed heavier than the mountain itself. Thomas McCain was a man hollowed out, a brittle shell of a human being held together by nothing but the calcified remains of his father's obsession. The border war with the millers had drained his meager savings, and the law was circling his property like vultures over a dying animal. He knew he had run out of time. If the serpent's hoard existed, it had to be found now, or the mountains would reclaim the secret forever. In a final, desperate act of defiance against fate, Thomas spent the last of the family's hidden cash of emergency cash to rent a machine of industrial destruction, a massive, rusted yellow excavator. The arrival of the machine was a desecration of the hollow's ancient silence. The sound of the heavy transport truck groaning up the narrow, mud-slicked road was a mechanical roar that sent the birds screaming from the trees. When the excavator finally crawled off the trailer on its massive iron tracks, it looked like a prehistoric beast of steel, its long hydraulic arm reaching out like the neck of a scavenger. The smell of the hollow was instantly transformed. The delicate scent of damp moss and mountain laurel was choked out by the thick, blue-black stench of diesel exhaust and the hot, metallic odor of hydraulic fluid. Thomas sat in the operator's cab, his hands trembling as he gripped the cold control levers. He had never operated such a beast, but his madness provided a strange, instinctive competence. He didn't start at the house. He went straight to the jagged bend in Crooked Creek, the place where John had drowned and where the serpent's maw yawned widest. As the engine revved, a violent, guttural scream echoed off the limestone cliffs, and the first iron bucketload of earth was ripped from the bank. The sound of the metal teeth grinding against the ancient rock was like the earth itself was being flayed alive. The scene was one of apocalyptic chaos. The excavator tore through the root systems of ancient oaks, pulling them from the ground with a sickening, wet crackle of wood. The creek, once clear and rhythmic, was instantly choked with red mud, turning into a thick, sluggish soup of silt and debris. Thomas worked with a manic energy,
the black smoke from the exhaust stack billowing into the sky and settling over the valley like a funeral shroud. The vibration of the engine rattled the very bones of the ridge, and back at the house, Eliza McCain huddled in the dark, her hammer forgotten as the floorboards shook beneath her feet. Thomas was no longer looking for signs or patterns. He was violating the earth. He dug deep trenches that bypassed the natural flow of the water, creating a scarred wasteland of mounds and craters. The smell of the disturbed earth was primal and suffocating, the scent of deep, anaerobic mud that hadn't seen the sun in 1,000 years, mixed with the sharp tang of crushed minerals. He worked through the day and into the twilight, the machine's twin headlamps cutting through the rising mist like the eyes of a demon. Every time the bucket struck a large boulder, a shower of sparks would fly, illuminating the sweat-streaked, soot-stained face of the last McCain. As the moon rose over the jagged peaks, the landscape had been rendered unrecognizable. The creek had been diverted into a series of stagnant, muddy pools, and the bank was a raw, bleeding wound of red clay. Thomas didn't care about the ruin he had created. In his mind, he was a surgeon cutting out a tumor to find the diamond within. He was convinced that the serpent's hoard had been paid in full, and that the mountain had no choice but to surrender. The air was thick with the heat of the engine and the heavy, humid breath of the disturbed valley. The great dig was the climax of a century of McCain greed. It was a violent rejection of the slow, patient life of the hills. Thomas was trying to force the mountain's hand, to rip the secret from its throat with iron and fire. But as the clock ticked toward midnight and the fuel gauge began to drop, the silence of the woods seemed to grow heavier around the roar of the engine. The trees that remained stood like spectators at a tragedy, their leaves coated in a fine layer of yellow diesel soot. Thomas McCain, perched in his iron throne, was a king of a kingdom of mud, waiting for a glint of gold that the earth was still refusing to show.
The night was deep, a velvet blackness that seemed to swallow the very light of the excavator's headlamps. Thomas McCain had been digging for 18 hours straight, his body vibrating in sync with the diesel engine's rhythmic thrum. The valley was a graveyard of uprooted timber and raw red clay. Then it happened. A sound that was not the dull thud of mud or the sharp crack of limestone. It was a hollow, resonant thump, followed by a screech of metal against something ancient and unyielding. The vibration traveled up the hydraulic arm, through the controls, and into Thomas's very bones. He cut the engine. The silence that followed was terrifying. The sudden absence of the roar left a vacuum filled only by the ticking of the cooling metal and the distant, mournful rush of the diverted creek. Thomas scrambled out of the cab, his boots sliding in the slick, waist-deep slurry of the pit. He used a handheld flashlight, its beam cutting a weak path through the rising mist. There, protruding from the vertical wall of the trench, was a sight that turned his blood to ice. It was not a chest of gold. It was a skull. As Thomas cleared the mud with his bare, bleeding hands, more appeared. Dozens of them. He had breached a forgotten trench, a mass grave from the Civil War era that the mountain had kept hidden for over a century. The skulls were yellowed and brittle, their jaws locked in eternal, silent screams, their empty sockets staring back at him with a hollow judgment. They were arranged in a strange, deliberate circle, a macabre crown of bone buried 15 feet beneath the surface. The smell was overwhelming, not the scent of fresh death, but the ancient, dry odor of calcium, wet earth, and something old and metallic that stung the nostrils. In the center of this ring of the dead sat the source of the metallic screech. It was a heavy, iron-bound chest, its surface encrusted with a century of mineral deposits and rust. As Thomas wiped away the grime, the flashlight revealed intricate, swirling engravings that made his heart stop. Coiled serpents, their scales rendered with obsessive detail, wound around the edges of the box, their eyes represented by dark, unpolished stones. It was the serpent's hoard. The atmosphere in the pit was suffocating. The air felt thick, as if the breath of the soldiers buried there had been trapped in a pocket of earth, waiting for this moment to exhale. Thomas felt a crushing weight on his chest, not of the mud, but of the realization that his father's treasure was guarded by a legion of the fallen. The blood tax was no longer a mystery. The hoard was anchored to the earth by the very bones of the men who had fought for this land.
The iron chest sat amidst the rib cages and femurs like a dark heart. Thomas reached out, his fingers brushing the cold, rusted lid, and for a moment the ground seemed to tremble beneath him, as if the mountain itself were groaning at the intrusion. He had found it, but the price of the unearthing was written in the hollow eyes of the skeletons surrounding him.
Thomas dragged the iron chest into the center of the farmhouse kitchen, the heavy metal leaving deep, jagged gouges in the floorboards his father had once paced. He was covered in the red mud of the mass grave, a skeletal figure illuminated by the flickering orange light of a single kerosene lamp. Eliza watched from the shadows of the hallway, her hammer clutched to her chest, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terminal dread. With a heavy crowbar, Thomas heaved against the rusted lock. With a violent metallic snap that echoed like a gunshot through the boarded-up house, the lid flew back. There was no glint of gold, no shimmer of silver, no precious stones. Inside the chest lay a thick stack of water-damaged envelopes, bound in rotting twine, and a leather-bound ledger. Thomas reached in, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly tore the fragile paper. The smell of the chest's interior was sharp, vinegar, old ink, and the scent of a long-forgotten betrayal. As he unfolded the first letter, the bitter truth began to seep out like poison. These were the letters of his grandfather and father, chronicling a secret far more wretched than a hidden treasure. There was no serpent's hoard. The gold was a fabrication, a legend Jacob McCain had concocted to explain away the blood on his hands. The letters detailed how the McCain men had used the chaos of the Civil War to murder their own cousins and neighbors, burying them in that hidden trench to seize the deed to the creekside timber. The treasure Jacob had spent his life searching for was actually the evidence of his own family's crimes, the original deeds, and the ledger of their sins. Jacob hadn't been looking for wealth. He had been looking for these papers to destroy them, his mind eventually warping the guilt into a vision of gold to keep himself from screaming. The blood tax wasn't an ancient curse. It was the weight of a century of fratricide. Thomas sat on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of his family, holding a handful of rotting paper that proved his father had gone mad from guilt, his brothers had died for a lie, and he had destroyed the land for nothing. The silence in the house was absolute, a cold, crushing vacuum that swallowed the last of his sanity. The serpent was not a hoard of gold, but the devouring nature of their own greed, a snake that had finally finished eating its own tail.
The realization did not bring Thomas McCain to tears. It brought him to the gasoline cans in the barn. He moved with a terrifying mechanical efficiency, his mind finally clear of the fog of gold. If the McCain legacy was built on blood and lies, then the only way to balance the ledger was to return it all to the ash from which it came. He began in the master bedroom, soaking the bed where Jacob had died, in a shroud of frozen terror. He moved to the kitchen, pouring the fuel over the iron chest and the letters of betrayal. The scent of gasoline was sharp and overwhelming, a modern chemical sting that cut through the ancient smells of the house. He walked to the parlor and struck a single match. The flame was a tiny, flickering thing for a second, before the gasoline caught with a soft, hollow whoosh. The fire moved like a living creature, racing across the floors and climbing the wallpaper that Eliza had tried so hard to protect. Thomas didn't run. He walked out onto the porch and sat in his father's old rocking chair, watching the orange glow through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The heat began to radiate through the timber, a fierce, cleansing warmth that the house hadn't felt in decades. Inside, the secret was being incinerated. The letters turned to black flakes, the ledger curled into ash, and the wooden snake carving on the mantelpiece crackled as it was consumed by the flames. The house began to roar, the fire breathing through the chimney like a dragon. The black smoke billowed into the night sky, a thick, greasy column that could be seen by the millers on the next ridge and by the people in the town 10 miles away. It was a funeral pyre for a dynasty of madness. As the roof began to groan and the first of the walls collapsed inward, Thomas sat motionless. He watched the sparks fly upward like tiny gold coins disappearing into the blackness of the mountain sky. For the first time in his life, the clink-clink of the pickaxe in his head was silent. The blood tax was finally being paid in full, not with gold, but with the total erasure of the McCain name. The fire was the only truth left in the hollow, a bright, beautiful destruction
that left nothing behind but the cold, indifferent stars.
By 1982, the scar on the hillside had begun to heal in the way that only the wilderness can manage, through a slow, relentless suffocating of the past. The site of the McCain farm was a study in green and gray. Nature had no memory of the serpent's hoard or the men who died for it. Thick, thorny blackberry briars had woven themselves through the rusted, blackened skeleton of the excavator Thomas had left in the pit. The machine looked like a fallen titan, its iron arm half buried in the silt, a perch for crows and a home for copperheads. The atmosphere was one of profound, heavy peace. The smell of the hollow had returned to its original state, the scent of damp earth, wild mint, and the sweet rot of the forest floor. The creek had long ago broken through Thomas's muddy dams, returning to its natural, winding path. It flowed over the site of the mass grave, the water scrubbing the bones clean and burying them once more beneath layers of smooth river stone and sand. The jagged craters were now shallow ponds filled with tadpoles and fallen leaves. There were no signs of the house, only a rectangular depression in the earth where the foundation had been. A few charred oak beams remained, half hidden by ferns and Queen Anne's lace. The forest was reclaiming the iron and the wood, turning the McCain tragedy into mulch. People from the town rarely ventured this far into the hollow anymore. They spoke of the place as hallowed or hollowed, a location where the air felt a few degrees colder and the birds sang a little less often. The mountain had won. It had absorbed the McCains, their greed and their fire, into its vast, unyielding history. The reclamation was total. The land didn't care about the deeds or the crimes. It only cared about the cycle of growth and decay. The only evidence that a family had once struggled and bled here was a single rusted Ford hubcap caught in the roots of a willow tree by the water's edge, a silver glint in the mud that looked from a distance like a discarded coin. On a lonely, wind-swept ridge overlooking the quiet hollow of Crooked Creek, there are 3 simple crosses. They are made of weathered cedar, silvered by a decade of Appalachian winters and sun-bleached by the harsh mountain summers. There are no names carved into the wood, no dates of birth or death. The townspeople who placed them there didn't want to commemorate the men. They wanted to mark the spot where the madness ended, a warning to any who might come looking for what was lost. The atmosphere at the final rest is one of absolute, lonely stillness. The wind whispers through the tall grass, a low, guttural sound that carries no words, only the sigh of the peaks. The smell of the ridge is clean, cold air and dry stone. From this height you can see the entire valley, a sea of green timber that hides the secrets of the McCains beneath the canopy of leaves. The crosses lean slightly to the west, bowing to the same winds that once rattled the windows of the farmhouse. There is no clinking of pickaxes anymore. There is no scratching at the floorboards. The serpent has returned to the earth, its coil settled deep within the limestone and the mud. The McCains are finally at peace, their legacy not one of gold or power, but of the silence that follows a long, terrible storm. The mountains have closed their mouth, and the blood tax has been settled. As the sun dips below the jagged horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the valley, the crosses stand as silent sentinels over a grave that is as large as the hollow itself. The story of Crooked Creek is over, buried in the only treasure that ever truly mattered, the quiet, unyielding earth.